The barter economy you learned about in school probably never existed the way you were taught. This is the first episode in a new thread, the history of money itself, how it actually works underneath everything we've already been talking about. Feels like a detour from behavioral finance. Stick with me. It's the same story, wearing a different costume. You know the story. Before money, people traded goods directly. I had extra grain, you had a spare goat, we swapped. It's a clean story. It's told in almost every economics textbook's opening chapter, and a growing number of historians and anthropologists think it's mostly a myth. Here's the actual problem with pure barter, the one the textbook story quietly skips past. It only works if I happen to want exactly what you have. At the exact same moment, you happen to want exactly what I have. Economists call that the coincidence of wants, and in any real complex community, it's actually pretty rare. I have grain, you have goats, but you don't want grain today. You want a new roof. Now what? Here's where this version of the story actually comes from. It's not folk wisdom. It's a specific, nameable source. Adam Smith wrote it down in 1776 in The Wealth of Nations, Book 1, Chapter 4. Smith described early societies solving the coincidence of wants problem by settling on one commonly wanted good to trade through, in his account, literally cattle. He described cattle as the common instrument of commerce in what he called the rude ages of society, clumsy as that must have been, with people valuing things by how many head of cattle they'd fetch in trade. From there, Smith's story moves to metals, portable, divisible, hard to fake, and eventually to coins. It's a tidy, logical progression. It's also, almost entirely, Smith reasoning from first principles about what probably would have happened, not reporting what the archaeological record actually shows. Economists repeated that story for close to 250 years as though it were observed history instead of an educated guess. The evidence anthropologists have actually found in the archaeological record in places like ancient Mesopotamia doesn't look like scattered barter at all. It looks like credit, ledgers, obligations, records of who owed what to whom, often tracked long before coins existed in any widespread form. You didn't need a goat and a roof to line up on the same day. You just needed people who trusted each other enough to say, "You owe me one, and we'll settle it eventually." Here's how specific that evidence actually gets. The Sumerians were running this system by roughly 3000 BCE. The shekel, a word you've probably heard in a modern context, wasn't originally a coin at all. It was a unit of weight, about 8.4 grams, used to measure out silver or barley on a balance scale. Temple and palace administrators tracked who owed what using that unit long before anyone stamped a piece of metal and called it currency. During the Ur-3 period, the state itself acted as the main creditor in the whole system, issuing land, animals, and grain, and keeping the tablets that recorded exactly who owed it back. That's not a barter economy with extra steps. That's a credit economy with genuinely good record-keeping, and it's not just Mesopotamia. In 1985, Cambridge anthropologist Caroline Humphrey published a survey of the actual ethnographic record. Every documented barter-based society researchers could find, looking specifically for a pure barter economy, the kind Adam Smith's story assumes came first. Her conclusion, in her own words, no example of a barter economy, pure and simple, has ever been described, let alone the emergence from it of money. All available ethnography suggests that there never has been such a thing. Not rare, not hard to find.
never documented anywhere by anyone at all. That's not a small crack in the textbooks, Squire. That's the foundation that formula when people find out looking for it.
So that's the myth, thoroughly taken apart, a specific author who wrote it down, and a specific example of it actually happening that nobody has ever found. But knowing what money's origin doesn't yet tell you what it actually was. That's the more interesting half of this.
I want to be fair to the other side of this because it's a really hard academic argument and not a settled fact either way. Plenty of economists still think some version of direct exchange came first in many cases, and that the credit for the story gets overstated in the other direction too. The honest answer is, we don't have one clear and universal origin story for money. We have competing accounts, and they don't all agree.
Here's an example that makes the trust idea concrete instead of abstract. On the Pacific island of Yap, the traditional currency was rai stones, carved limestone discs, some over 10 feet across, far too heavy to actually move once they were set in place. Economist Milton Friedman wrote about this in a 1991 essay called The Island of Stone Money. When ownership of a huge stone changed hands, as payment for a debt, a dowry, whatever, the stone itself often just stayed exactly where it was. Everyone on the island simply updated their shared understanding of who owned it now. Friedman's actual point wasn't, look how quaint. It was, look how familiar. He compared it directly to the Federal Reserve Bank of New York's gold vault, where other countries' gold has historically sat in the same physical drawer, while ownership shifted between nations purely on paper. In 1932, when France formally requested delivery of gold it was owed from the United States, that request itself helped trigger a wave of banking panic in America, not because any gold physically moved differently than usual, but because the request made people suddenly doubt the ledger they'd been trusting without thinking about it. Move a stone, move a number in a vault's paperwork. Either way, the actual transaction was always the belief, not the object. But here's what almost every serious version of the story agrees on, whichever one turns out to be more right. What actually made exchange possible, before or alongside physical money, was trust. A shared working belief that an obligation would eventually be honored. That belief is the real invention. Coins and later paper and later a number on a banking app are just increasingly portable ways of carrying that same trust around. Here's why this isn't just a history detour. The balance in your bank account right now isn't a pile of paper sitting in a vault with your name on it. It's a ledger entry, an institution's promise that it'll hand you real currency or move real value when you ask for it. Deposit insurance, the whole apparatus of banking regulation, audits, reserve requirements, all of that exists for one reason: to keep that promise credible enough that you don't have to personally verify it every time you check your balance. You're not holding money, you're holding trust, wrapped in enough institutional scaffolding that it doesn't feel like trust anymore. It just feels like a number that's obviously, solidly yours, which means every time that collective trust breaks, and we'll get into exactly what that looks like in full in a future episode on hyperinflation, it isn't really the money that's failing, it's the shared belief underneath it. The container was never the point. It just makes the fragile thing feel solid enough to carry around in your pocket. That reframes something important about what money actually is. It was never really the metal or the paper or the number on the screen. Those are just the current container. The actual substance being exchanged the whole time underneath every form money has ever taken has been a promise other people are willing to believe in. I left the herd. I never left the plains. We'll go deep on what happens when that trust actually breaks in a future episode. Subscribe so you don't miss it.